See, we have a very good crowd. And my name is Dr. Harold Isaacs, and I've been teaching here for quite a few years. And I started this series back in 1981. So we're celebrating our 32nd anniversary. And this sort of served as a basis to for us to establish the Association of Third World Studies, which is a global organization. And in fact, our participants are outstanding members of it. And Bill Head here, William Head, is one of the founding members, and Jim Gillum and Gary Klein, of course, a very key member, and officer Bill also. And we're about to have our 31st meeting in India in December 28th, December 30th. And then we went ahead and things continued to develop. We started Journal of Third World Studies, and I think the 60th issue is coming out in the spring. So there's a lot of third world studies here at Georgia Southwestern. I want to take this opportunity to thank the administration, the president, Dr. Kendall Blanchard, for support throughout the years. It's been very important as far as our progress is concerned. We have a lot of people here. I want to welcome all the students. Also want to welcome Ms. Randy Head, who's the wife of Bill Head over here on the right, and Ms. Connie Blanchard sitting there in the back next to Dr. Brian Smith, Dr. Richard Hall, and Dr. Phil Smedra, and also Kathy Zach, who's our production person for Journal of Third World Studies, and Paul Zach, her husband. And Kathy is a very key person for the journal. In fact, we were talking about it before. If we didn't have Kathy when the production work, we probably wouldn't have a journal. So, thank you very much. I'll thank you publicly. And also in the front row here, Sarah Lee Turner, who is the wife of Neil Turner, who was a founding member of the organization, Association of Third World Studies, back in 1983, and then Lillian Lopez to her right, who's one of our key supporters. So anyhow, I don't have to tell you the importance of the third world. I think we hear about it every night, whether it's Syria or North Korea, or if it's Afghanistan or Iran or Venezuela, wherever it is, it's the third world. And, you know, tonight we have an outstanding program, and I want to thank the participants coming down here, Bill Head and Jim Gillum, and Gary Klein's here. So I want to thank them. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the program over to Dr. Klein, and he'll moderate it and serve as discussant, and then I'll introduce Dr. Klein. So again, thank you, and I hope you enjoy the seminar, and I appreciate your support. We all do. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Isaacs. Embedded in that introduction was a lot of the information I wanted to convey here at the start of our program, but I'm going to reiterate a few points. Dr. Isaacs has been running this program, this Third World in Perspective program, since 1981, a long time now. And I'd hate to try to count up all the number of students who have benefited and faculty members and community members who have benefited from these programs. He's given them, if I'm not mistaken, every single semester since 1981, and sometimes 2 or 3 in a semester. And so this has been a very important piece of the educational picture here at Georgia Southwestern. He also is the founder of the Association of Third World Studies, which happens to be today the largest professional association for the study of third world issues in the world. And there are members across the globe. There are chapters in Africa and in Asia. So this small institution can pride itself on being the home of the Association of Third World Studies, a very important academic and educational resource. And I want to say that Dr. Isaacs has been not only a great friend and colleague, but he had such a vision. You know, a few decades ago, most people hadn't really given much thought to the third world and issues that come from the third world, and that was a shame. Increasingly, the topic we're covering today, Vietnam, we may have made fewer mistakes there had there been an association like this that was disseminating information and generating discussion and awareness of these issues. But in the past, Americans didn't think all that much about the third world, countries of Latin America, Asia, Africa. And now we know, of course, that it's absolutely critical. It's critical that we understand these parts of the world where about 3/4 of the world's people live. So we can't ignore them, and it certainly helps us if we're aware of what's going on. So I just wanted to make the point that Dr. Isaacs has done us all a great service, and he spent many, many years hard work at this. And I'd like us to give him a round of applause. Well, tonight we have two distinguished scholars to talk to us about Vietnam. It's an issue that I grew up with, and some of the rest of us grew up with, and maybe not talked about that much these days, but it's an issue that we can still learn something from, looking at the history of our involvement in that war. Our first speaker is Dr. James T. Gilliam, professor of history at Spelman College in Atlanta. He earned his PhD in Chinese history from Ohio State University. He teaches classes in world history, in the history of China and Japan, history of Vietnam, and numerous other courses. He is a combat veteran of the Vietnam War. He was a sergeant in the 1st Battalion, so he speaks from firsthand knowledge. He's published 2 books on the war, detailing some of his personal experiences. He's currently working on a PBS documentary entitled The Impact of the War on Soldiers and Their Families. He's received many honors, including a Presidential Award for Excellence in Teaching, and he's the past president of the Southeast region of the Association of Asian Studies. Tonight, his topic is entitled The Tet Offensive of 1968 as a Catalyst for Change. And I'd like us to give a warm welcome to Dr. Gilliam.
That was a very gracious introduction, and I'm very happy to be here and, and to have so many people come and hear my comments this evening. I guess I'll just get right to the story here, and then we can have some questions and discussions later. This whole talk is about a critical event called the Tet Offensive of 1968. And my observation, and hopefully some rational support of this observation, that particular offensive was a catalyst for change in many areas, both on the battlefield and outside the battlefield. So, okay, let's get to the story here. In every war, there are either battles or campaigns that are watershed events that change the direction of the conflict. One of those campaigns in the Vietnam War was what the Vietnamese call the Tet Offensive. This term in Vietnamese means the Tet Holiday General Offensive and Uprising. Americans have thankfully shortened the title and call it just the Tet Offensive. When that Tet Offensive erupted in January of 1968, it was recognized by many people in Vietnam and elsewhere as an event that would have widespread and important consequences. It ushered in an era of change in many aspects related to the Vietnam War. The areas that were most immediately and deeply affected were the tactics, the strategy, American foreign policy, and ultimately even the shape of the upcoming presidential election. My talks this evening will provide exemplars and explanations of the changes wrought by the Tet Offensive in each of these areas. The Tet Offensive was a coordinated, nearly simultaneous attack of national proportions by the People's Liberation Army, we call them the Viet Cong, and the North Vietnamese Army, we call them the NVA. Their targets were carefully chosen for their tactical, strategic, and political importance. The offensive began in the Central Highlands before dawn on the morning of January 30th, 1968, and inside 24 hours, 36 of South Vietnam's 44 provincial capitals, 5 of its 6 autonomous cities, and 64 of the 242 district capitals had been swept into the battle that was called Tet. One of the planners of the Tet Offensive was General Tran Van Trap. He was commander of the People's Liberation Forces in Vietnam, and he also held operational command with responsibility for carrying out this offensive. The first objective was to attack and destroy the bulk of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, known in your textbooks as the ARVN. He also wanted to cripple the South Vietnamese government at all levels. Finally, he wanted to incite a popular uprising to replace Saigon's administration in the southern half of Vietnam. It was for this reason that Tran and most of the Vietnamese call the event the Tet Offensive, and that's why we get the general uprising added to this event. Tran and the Politburo in Hanoi also planned to destroy major portions of American forces and their materiel in the southern half of Vietnam. The objective there was to prevent the American forces from meeting their political and military obligation to support the Saigon government and its ARVN troops. Tran's plans also had the objectives at the strategic and foreign policy level. There they hoped to force America to accept both military and political defeat in southern Vietnam and end all aggression against the northern half of the country. He summed up those objectives by saying emphatically We were determined to break America's will to war. He told me that in a personal interview, and he's also gave that precise objective in many of his talks about this event. So now let's go to consider changes in the tactical and strategic picture in the war. When the Tet began, the American escalation phase, our involvement in Vietnam, was in the middle of its third year. The surge of men, material, and money into the war had begun with the congressional approval of a document called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in August of '64. That resolution required that the American military take upon itself the tactical and strategical burdens of searching out and destroying this elusive Viet Cong and also the North Vietnamese army. So we patrolled in the villages and the swamps and the mountainous jungles of Vietnam, and the task of guarding the cities and military installations was left to our allies, the ARVN. Before Tet, most Americans and their commanders in Vietnam felt we were fighting a limited guerrilla war and sustaining relatively small and therefore politically acceptable casualties. That changed. There we go. That changed when the Tet Offensive started. Can you still hear me? Okay, good. The offensive immediately shattered both images of relative safety in the cities and near major bases. The perception of limited American casualties from a sporadic contact went up in smoke. In 1992, Ronald Spector, a Vietnam veteran and also an historian, put the casualty reports into a stunning historical context. I'm going to read you a quote here. In the first week of the offensive, 203 Americans were killed, and that was the lowest number of deaths for 6 months covered in his report. He made a report to the White House. The death rate peaked the second week of May of 1968. 616 Americans died, and on 4 occasions there were weeks when there were about 500 deaths a week. From January to July 1968, the overall rate of men killed in action in Vietnam reached an all-time high and exceeded, I say again, exceeded the rate for the Korean War and the Mediterranean and Pacific theaters during World War II. So the notion that we had a limited guerrilla engagement kind of disappeared in 1968. Can you see this, the figures clearly? Okay. The dramatic change in the tactical picture that Spector outlined in his book began in the central highlands of Vietnam, and within 12 hours, every major city and major military installation had been attacked. In those battles, the tactic of limited and brief guerrilla engagements was replaced by prolonged battles that involved days and weeks. Typically, a guerrilla engagement lasted 10 minutes, 15 minutes. They also involved units of a size that had not been seen since the fall of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. For example, in the Central Highlands alone, Tran committed 17,700 main force NVA soldiers and 39,800 of his own Viet Cong for the struggle in the Central Highlands. Casualties among those units were staggering. They lost 65% of their forces. 32,500 of them were killed in action, 5,500 were taken prisoner. Now I'm going to take you to the battle for Kon Tum, because that is my example for tactical change. The Tet Offensive began with a 3 a.m. attack on Kon Tum City, the capital of the province of that same name, and the adjacent military base where both ARVN and American troops were stationed. Time and space this evening preclude a detailed account of the tactical picture for all of the battles. So for the sake of brevity, I just want to take you through some of the highlights at Khartoum City and the adjacent bases. From the very moment when the combined force of NVA and Viet Cong struck at Khartoum, nothing about tactics employed fit the previous pattern of quick guerrilla strikes and withdrawals. The Viet Cong guerrillas were there, but there were 1,000 of them rather than the customary 10-man squad or 50-man platoon. They were accompanied by 500 light force NVA infantry, 400 elite commandos, and 3,000 main force infantry from the NVA 95B regiment. Before Tet, guerrilla attacks were sometimes supported by small 60mm mortars. That's kind of like your portable cannon. You can carry it in your backpack. But that also changed. There was an artillery regiment, the 200th Artillery Regiment, added the punch of their long-range cannons from the nearby mountains. So in all, there were over 4,000 Vietnamese involved in the attack at Khartoum City. The attackers went straight for the residences of Lieutenant Colonel Duan and Lieutenant Colonel William Hoyland, the American commander on the spot. Lieutenant Colonel, there was also another Lieutenant Colonel named Junk. Junk's initial response to the situation in Khartoum was also far removed from the customary small guerrilla response. The first thing he did was assign 2/3 of an infantry battalion to the task of trapping the Tet attackers between the barbed wire of the army base and the banks of the Dak Bla River. Reconnaissance units before Tet usually involved a 10-man squad, or a 43-man platoon at most. Junk got in a helicopter and ordered a combat assault, a helicopter landing, in other words, on selected parts of Khartoum City to conduct a search and destroy mission inside the city. The usual arena for those kinds of tactics had been in the mountains of the Central Highlands or in the swamps down in the Mekong Delta, but this time Colonel Junk dropped his men directly into parking lots, marketplaces, instead of elephant grass landing zones. The usual jungle encounter lasted 10-15 minutes because the enemy usually cut and ran and took their wounded with them, so the American forces were never sure how many they had killed and therefore how well our war of attrition was working. At Khartoum, the enemy dug in and fought Junk's men for 36 straight hours. After 36 hours in this battle, Junk called for and received major reinforcements from General Hickman, the commander of the 4th Infantry Division. Hickman threw 7 more rifle companies, the equivalent of over two battalions, a company of tanks, and a battery of howitzer cannon into the fight. The battle for Khartoum had become what Colonel Junk later described as Stalingrad without snow. After 3 more days of continuous combat, the enemy withdrew to prepared positions on Hill 864 on the northern side of the city. It was, in effect, a challenge to Americans to come forward if they dared and risk more heavy casualties in an assault. Colonel Junk accepted that challenge and moved to a 3rd phase of his response in Khartoum. The tactical reality of pursuing that challenge was really a simple thing. It was a tactic that had not been used much since the Korean War. We're talking about a straightforward company abreast assault by 2 battalions of infantrymen, backed up by tanks and preceded by a heavy artillery barrage. Fights in the jungle usually involved 40 people, 50 on the outside. An infantry company is 143 men. A battalion is 4 infantry companies. We didn't use tanks very much in the jungle either. Okay. On February 7, a week after the first shots were fired at Khartoum, Hill 864 finally fell to the Americans. The count of enemy casualties was both verifiable and far beyond what had happened in the jungle fights. Colonel Junk's after-action report said that his men had fought over 4,000 enemy, and when Hill 864 finally fell, the enemy had lost 1,382 dead. Americans lost 12 dead, 151 wounded, and the ARVN lost 12 dead and 86 wounded. So, let's move on to the changing political situation with a peek at the media. In the fall before Tet, there had been anti-war demonstrations across the country, one of which brought 100,000 people to the Lincoln Memorial in D.C. President Lyndon Johnson's response to the anti-war demonstrations was to create a carefully constructed print media image that said we were winning the war, and in the early days of Tet, the media continued to present that image. Johnson's print media support may have held the line for him in the preceding fall, but from the very first day of Tet, the visual media posted a series of images from the war that contradicted his idea of victory. One set of the most violent and well-photographed images showed the Viet Cong raid on the American embassy itself on January 31st. Americans saw photos of the aftermath of a Viet Cong car bomb used to breach the embassy wall and take up positions to threaten the entire compound. There was also an attack 5 blocks away on the personal residence of Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker. He was photographed being escorted from his residence to a place of safety by armed guards. Then the day after the embassy attack, there were both film and still coverage that severely damaged the construct of victory. In these pictures, a Viet Cong, the last of his unit, was captured and delivered with bound hands to General Nguyen Ngoc Loan, commander of the Saigon police force. Luan immediately shot the man in the head with a large caliber revolver. AP press photographer Eddie Abrams recorded the killing, and as the Vietnamese cameraman working for NBC also photographed this incident. The film was shown on NBC's evening newscast, and the photo actually ended up on the next edition of Newsweek magazine. So, although later scholarship would deny the veracity of the idea, Lyndon Johnson said that he felt the effective press coverage had cost him the political support of the American public for his policies in Vietnam. Johnson watched Walter Cronkite, a well-respected journalist who gave a negative view on Tet on the evening news, and Johnson made the comment, "If I have lost Walter Cronkite, I have lost Mr. Average Citizen." The changing political situation also moved into the Senate, the public itself, the cabinet, and the lower house of Congress. In all truth, during the first 3 months of Tet, American and ARVN forces had achieved a stunning tactical victory over the NVA and the Viet Cong, But in the end, America suffered a major political defeat. In those months, Johnson saw dissent among his cabinet over the war, and he also was faced with harsh criticism from key members in the Senate, and that was from both Democratic and Republican senators. In the cabinet, Clark Clifford, Johnson's new Secretary of Defense, turned down the Pentagon request for an additional 206,000 troops to respond to Tet. Democratic Senator Robert Kennedy and Republican George Aiken, both were members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, made very critical statements against the president's policies. Kennedy, for example, said that the Tet Offensive had, quote, finally shattered the mask of official illusion with which we have concealed our true circumstances even from ourselves. Senator Aiken, commenting on Johnson's images and pronouncements of failure on the Viet Cong, said, quote, if this is a failure, I hope the Viet Cong never have a major success. Finally, on March 31st, 1968, Lyndon Johnson himself announced a major change in policy. In less than a week before that speech, America had lost 614 men killed in action. The ARVN had lost over 1,500, and there were 200,000 refugees in South Vietnam. Even the most cursory analysis of Johnson's speech at that time reveals that it was truly a turning point in the war. He had decided to send a new set of signals to Hanoi. First, he let them know they could expect an olive branch in the form of a bombing halt against northern Vietnam. He hoped it would bring them to productive talks at the Paris Peace Conference. He also let them know that the MACV commander, Military Assistance Command, who had the task of conducting the war of attrition in Vietnam, was no longer in charge. General William Westmoreland was called home. They promoted him. They kind of like kicked him upstairs, but they took him away from direct involvement in the war. Then finally, Lyndon Johnson effectively resigned from the presidency. It was a signal of a major policy change. It was a signal of his personal dismay over the shocking numbers of casualties. And it was also probably an acknowledgement that Tran Van Tra had broken our will to war. Johnson said that he would not run for the presidency and he would not accept the nomination to be the candidate from his party. So he effectively resigned from the presidency in March of 1968 as a signal to the Vietnamese that we're out of here. Okay. I'll probably entertain some questions after my colleague gets done. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gilliam. I've been reminded there are sign-up sheets going around for various courses, so if you're expecting to sign in, you should look for one of those sheets. My classes and Dr. Isaac's, they're circulating around here with some help. Thank you, Dr. Tate. Our second speaker is Dr. William Head. Dr. Head was a founding member of the ATWS, the Association of Third World Studies. It's hard to imagine how ATWS could have gotten off the ground without his foundational support, and he's been an active member and supporter ever since. So we've seen him on this campus a number of times, and we're glad to welcome him back. He is the chief historian at Warner Robins Air Force Base. He's a nationally known authority on foreign affairs in U.S. foreign affairs in Asia, and he's got some 20 books to his credit already. And in case you think he's a slacker, he's working on another one, so it won't look so bad. He has been the president of ATWS. He has served as the president of the Southeast region of the Association of Asian Studies. He, too, has received many awards and honors in his lifetime, including the U.S. Air Force Outstanding Historian Award. Tonight he's going to speak to us. His topic is entitled Bernard Fall, the Western Conscience in Indochina. Welcome, Dr. Head.
And as a matter of fact, since my wife is here, I also take out the garbage real good and mow the grass and do that sort of stuff. Thank you, Gary. We're a dinosaur, techno dinosaurs, so we're working on trying to get my stuff up here.
I got you.
You got me already? God. Thank you. Well, Jim we sort of went in reverse, you know, like Hollywood now likes to do prequels and stuff like that. So I'm going to do the prequel, all right? And I'm going to talk to you about a guy who, before there was Walter Cronkite and all these famous guys on TV now that are news people, was the sort of the original correspondent, scholar, whatever you want, who went to Vietnam to search out the truths that were there on his own. And the interesting thing about Bernie Fall is the fact that in the early 60s, as the United States was getting deeper and deeper involvement in Vietnam, he wrote not one but two books. In fact, in his lifetime he wrote 8 or 9 that were pretty important, but these two were particularly important. In essence, warning the United States about what could happen if they made the same mistakes that the French had made there a generation earlier. And as you heard from Jim, we didn't listen, and we got into the same mess. Now I'm going to read this because if I don't, I'll just sit here and lecture for about an hour or two, and then you'll all fall asleep, and that'll be terrible. Over the long history of our nation, war correspondents have provided the public with a window into the horrors of war and a gauge as to the relative justice and merit of each conflict. In World War II, Ernie Pyle wrote about the hardship of the regular soldiers, and in Vietnam, reporters like Walter Cronkite and Morley Safer made it a television war, one that eventually led us in this country to question the validity of our very presence in Vietnam. Before these more famous reporters affected public opinion on America's struggle in Vietnam, before these in Vietnam, there was a man of great integrity who went there to find out for himself why we were there and whether we should be there at all. And there's Bernie Fall. Those of you who have read much about the U.S. involvement in the wars of Southeast Asia have heard of Bernard Fall. In so many ways, his humane writings and reporting, both as a scholar and a reporter, made the soldiers he lived with include him as one of their own. His work was not only important during his lifetime, but continues to be required reading in many classes on the study of Vietnam. His most famous books are Hell in a Very Small Place, about the French-Vietnam men struggle for Dien Bien Phu, and his later work, Street Without Joy, which chronicle the U.S. struggles in Vietnam during the late 50s and early 60s, mostly along the coastal highway from Da Nang to the north. And people never were book titles more poignant. While Bernie Fall became one of America's foremost experts in Indochina, things did not begin that way. He was born in Vienna, Austria in November 1926, and being a Jew, his father Leon and his mother Anna moved the family to France in 1938 when the Nazis annexed Austria. Following the defeat of France in 1940, his father joined the resistance. In 1942, his father was captured by the Gestapo and literally tortured to death. His mother was subsequently seized and sent to Auschwitz, where she also died. Fall also joined the underground, barely escaping death on several occasions. In 1944, he joined the Free French Army and marched into Paris in August of 1944. He won the French Liberation Medal, and fittingly, after the war, he served as an analyst for the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal. After the war, he studied at the University of Paris and later the University of Munich. Receiving a Fulbright scholarship in 1951, he traveled to the U.S. where he studied political science at the University of Maryland. And 2 years later, he completed his master's at Syracuse University. He subsequently took courses at Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies, where he became fascinated with Southeast Asia. In 1953, he went to Vietnam for the first time. Being French, he was allowed to accompany French soldiers in their struggle against the vaunted Viet Minh. He soon concluded that the French would not win the war, a shock to the people back home. And when they did lose, he blamed the French for their cruelty toward the Indochinese people and their ignorance of the people that they governed for so many years. In 1955, he earned a PhD at Syracuse, and from there he became an assistant professor at American University. He also began teaching classes in international relations across town at Howard University. While he would eventually make full professor at Howard, his most important achievements at this time proved to be the publication of his first book on Indochina entitled Hell in a Very Small Place, The Siege of Dien Bien Phu. Well received by both the popular media and fellow scholars, it proved a vivid description of the arduous and, in retrospect, hopeless struggle by the French Union Army against the Viet Minh at Dien Bien Phu. Indeed, the New Yorker magazine called it a thorough account of a brave, sanguinary battle that has since turned out to have immense historic importance. While his main job remained as professor, Fall returned to Vietnam 5 times between 1957 and 67. He believed, and his writings proved, that the best research was to see the conflict firsthand. In 1962, while teaching at the Royal Institute of Administration in Cambodia, Fall was invited to interview Ho Chi Minh. And in case you don't know who that is, Ho Chi Minh was the head of the North Vietnamese. Fall shocked many with this interview in the West when he reported that Ho had told him that his forces would reunify Vietnam in little more than a decade. That was in 1962. In 1972, the North Vietnamese did reunite Vietnam. Which is this? Okay. There we go. Even though Fall was an academic, he also had an affinity for the average combat soldier, as I said before. As the war expanded and America became involved, he became a favorite of the guys in the field. Because he lived with them, facing their fear and their boredom, he obtained his data on the war while slogging through the jungles of Vietnam first with the French colonial troops, and later American infantry and South Vietnamese soldiers. He combined academic analysis of Indochina with a perspective of the war from the soldier's point of view. Like Ernie Pyle, a generation early in World War II, he became one of them. Someone they could explain things to, someone who understood their struggle just to survive. The early 1960s, Fall fully supported the U.S. military presence in South Vietnam, believing it would stop the country from falling to communism. However, he grew increasingly critical of U.S. military tactics and America's puppet, Premier Ngo Dinh Diem. Throughout the 1960s, Fall grew increasingly pessimistic about America's hopes for victory. He warned that if they did not learn from France's mistakes, they too would lose. Fall wrote numerous articles and gave lectures expressing his views of the situation in Vietnam. They were so well respected that many U.S. diplomats and military leaders used these same ideas to develop their own opinions. Unfortunately, his beliefs, especially that the U.S. was losing the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese, caught the attention of the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, who then began to, quote unquote, monitor his activities. As a result, far too often his reports never reached the White House or the Congress or were not regarded seriously. The irony is that the most policymakers and scholars since then have come to the conclusion that Fall was probably one of the clearest analysts of the war ever. And what would later prove to be a supreme irony, in his 1995 biography, My American Journey, former General and later Secretary of State Colin Powell declared, quote, "I recently reread Bernie Fall's book on Vietnam, Street Without Joy. Fall makes it painfully clear that we had almost no understanding of what we had gotten ourselves into. I cannot help thinking that if President Kennedy or President Johnson had spent a quiet weekend at Camp David reading that perceptive book, they would have returned to the White House Monday morning and immediately started to figure out a way to extricate us from the quicksand of Vietnam," end quote. They did not, and neither did Powell and the Bush administration 45 years later. On February 21st, 1967, while with a company of the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines during Operation Chinook, along the Street Without Joy, Fall stepped on what is euphemistically, kind of cruelly, known as a Bouncing Betty landmine. And he was killed along with Gunnery Sergeant Byron G. Highland, a U.S. Marine Corps combat photographer. He was dictating notes into a big, bulky tape recorder. Last words were, quote, "We've reached one of our phase lines after the firefight, and it smells bad, meaning it's a little bit suspicious. It's quiet, too quiet, could be an M." Those were his last words. Fall left behind a wife and 3 daughters. Of course, the most famous book by Fall is the one I've already mentioned, Street Without Joy, which chronicled the ground war from an up-close and personal point of view. And what is today recognized as a quote-unquote masterpiece, Fall tried to paint for Americans a clear picture of where the U.S. policies had gone wrong and how to fix them. In the book, he warned the U.S. to learn from past mistakes. Published in 1962, 3 years before the beginning of the U.S. buildup, Fall provided his readers with an exceptionally strong historical and political analysis of the region, its people, and their leaders. Of greatest impact on current foreign affairs were the basic lessons that Fall wanted American leaders to learn. He wanted America to be very slow to go to war and risk the flower of our youth. Once committed, he wanted them to have a plan and vision for victory, that would bring the U.S. to an end game. In short, from the outset, America needed to have an exit strategy that kicked in as quickly and conclusively as possible. He hoped that once in place, this strategy would become part of America's basic foreign policy. In the end, it seemed that Washington elite, then and now, disregarded the quality of the material and the skill of the messenger as they barged headlong into what was, at the time, the longest and most divisive war in U.S. history. It was one that would ultimately cause America to question itself and the honesty and integrity of her leaders. Fall did not condemn or condone French and Americans for trying to stem the tide of communism. Instead, he warned against the apparent arrogance of their leaders. He truly believed that if the French defeat was born of ignorance, and he did, America's came from a hubris that 35 years later would plunge America into yet another protracted engagement, this one in Central Asia, and it has lasted longer than Vietnam. George Santayana said, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to relive it." If this is true, before policymakers send American men and women into foreign lands, they need to adapt their tactical schemes by learning the lessons taught by people like Bernie Fall. You would think that the U.S. would never again allow U.S. troops to walk down any street without joy. But they have, because, as Bernie Fall declared in his last book, Last Reflections on War, not learning from the past mistakes can be deadly. There are 95,000 white French crosses all over Indochina that bear witness to poor French strategic and tactical leadership. The 58,000 American names on the wall silently attest to the folly of conceit, as do 9,000 Allied soldiers who have paid the supreme price in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, many years later, after Bernie was long dead, to honor Mr. Fall and to try to remind us of the cost of war, a very fine gentleman by the name of Paul LaForest wrote a poem. The poem is known simply as The Street Without Joy. And if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read it to you because I think it's important. Along the street without joy, a young Vietnamese boy rides bareback in the rice paddy fields. Where French troops took the bait, repeatedly lured to their fate, today time and jungle conceals. Oh, the street without joy, as the highway to Hanoi, 'twas a symbol clearly echoed elsewhere, and the victorious Viet Minh sucked those French forces in, consumed this guerrilla warfare. From the DMZ down to Hue, where the entombed emperors lay, the street without joy runs north to Touraine, and this place 'twas so called, since French troops there were mauled by enemy ambushes time and again. Patrols to search and destroy along the street without joy, in the jungle deltas and hills of Annam, similar strategies employed. Sweet success thus enjoyed up and down and right across Vietnam. North, south, or west from the coast, each isolated military post, 'twas overrun with consummate ease. From Mai Tho to Nha Trang, from Pleiku to Da Nang, such attacks finally brought France to her knees. One last fortress and rubble burst this imploding rice bubble. Troop withdrawals and elections follow. Peace conditions decided by great powers who presided, solid promises that proved to be hollow. Around a decade's delay, and then a second replay with new players lined up in each team. Under a 60s new name, playing the same kind of game, 10 years of denting the American dream. Although past tactics found flawed, all those old lessons ignored, thousands of French troops, each died in vain. So new ambushes laid, hit-and-run battle games played. The street without joy fell into darkness again. In the city market, shops and bars, in hotels, streets, and bazaars, acquiescence again masked a disguise. And any success in the field, researchers later revealed, 'twas imagined, or quite often just lies. Tet saw the embassy raided, many key towns invaded. Quezon, another lure, a ploy. And when Hui's citadel fell, again the gates opened to hell, an inferno on the street without joy. As the body count rose to a level no one knows, the Paris peace talks continued to stall. Vietnamization, a sham excuse to exit Vietnam. No more names for that black granite wall. And an author who spoke of this place when he wrote, ironically returned and joined the long line. Oh, this tragic street without joy, his life too would destroy when Bernie Falls stepped out onto a mine. Dominoes fell one by one until there were none. Chaos contagious during the siege of Saigon as palace gates crashed to the ground. The street without joy was closed down since the West had gone home. Today, just like a ghost, by that road on the coast, riding a buffalo ubiquitous, 'tis a boy. And yet there are no signs on either side of the thousands who died, just memories on the street without joy. You know, let me conclude by telling you this little story. Years later, I went to one of my myriad of Vietnam conferences, and Paul was there. And in the questions and answers afterwards, somebody asked, was there anything he could draw positive from the American experience in Vietnam? And his comment was, yes, I've thought about it for a long time. And the one thing I'm quite convinced is that this country will never be so foolish to do that again. At this moment, we have spent 12 years plus in Afghanistan fighting another war that apparently we cannot win. We have lost 2,300 Americans killed in Afghanistan and 4,500 in Iraq for what many now are beginning to believe was a questionable cause. And we were still there, and we won't leave, at least apparently, for another year. I fear we have broken faith with the dead whose names are on that black gray wall in Washington. And so may I echo Bernie Fall's lessons and Paul LaForest's challenge to you in this room tonight to please keep faith with this generation of dead so that it won't happen again. Thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure now to introduce our discussant, my good friend and colleague, Gary Klein, Dr. Gary Klein. And Gary, first, before the introduction, I want to thank you for all the kind tributes that you paid to me, really throughout my career, but especially on February 5th. When you organized that celebration of my career here at Georgia Southwestern, I really appreciate that, and I appreciate all the kind words you've said about me. Gary has been here almost unbelievable, 23 years. Started in 1990, and I remember when he first came, and right from the beginning, he supported the Third World Studies program. And that wasn't true of everybody that, was new on campus. But he believed in it, and of course he has supported it ever since in various ways, as an officer, treasurer, as president, and so forth. And he's had a great career. As you all know, he's professor and chair of the History and Political Science Department. He got all his degrees from the University of Texas at Austin. Is author of a book, teaches various classes. And of course, he's been a member of our editorial board for, I guess, as long as he's been here. And served as treasurer for 9 years. He took over for me as treasurer, and I was really grateful for that. And did an excellent job. And then he was president, 2007, 2008. And then he's received just about every ATWS award, Association Third World Studies Award. And then he was the first recipient of Board of Regents Distinguished Professor for Teaching and Learning Award. And then just recently, 2 years ago, university honored him with the Excellence and Commitment to Teaching Award. But I don't know anybody, and of course I'm only part-time now, but I'm here, I guess, every other day, that works harder for this university than Gary. And I wish he had more time, because he's also a great scholar as well as a great teacher. But I don't know anyone really in my years here, and I go back to 1965, that's more devoted to this university. And Gary, I just want you to know how much I appreciate on behalf of everybody on the faculty and the administration, how much we value your work and your dedication to the university. And now I want to introduce you as a discussant. You have to live up to it.
Thank you, Dr. Isaacs, for the kind introduction. It's probably going to be longer than my discussion. Sounds like I deserve a salary increase. None of those these days. We had two really fine presentations. They're full of good information, thought-provoking. I don't want to take too much time with my part of this program. I want to turn this over to the rest of you, but just make a couple of comments. As I mentioned before, I grew up in a time when the Vietnam War loomed very large in people's minds, and it had a big impact on the way I think. And I've drawn some conclusions. I think study of history is very important for you all, the students who are here, because history is shining a light on decisions that we have to make today and in the future. If you learn history, you can avoid some of the mistakes of the past. And one thing I've concluded is that virtually every war begins in ignorance. Certainly the Vietnam War did. We didn't know what we were getting into. We didn't understand the region, the people, the culture, much of anything else. And while you're here in college, one of the things you really need to be doing is opening your mind to other parts of the world, other peoples, other cultures, understanding them. I'm equally convinced that it's very hard to hate and go to war with people that you understand and you know pretty well. The more we understand others, the less likely it is that we will get into a war or conflict with them. And so, college, this is your opportunity to grow your minds, to learn about other people, and to gain a certain sense of tolerance for other people who think differently than you and do things a little differently. Vietnam is full of lessons for us, and I'm sure you have some questions out there. So I'm going to turn this program over to you all and let you ask some questions of our presenters. Where do we want to get started?
I'm not a student, but I would like to know, why did we go into this war, and why they didn't listen to McNamara when he said we should not go to this war?
Why did we go into Vietnam? What led us into a path that had been tried and seen failure numerous times before? Let me turn this over to you all.
We got into it because it was the working out of the Cold War. It was actually war by proxy against the expansion of the Communist Chinese, as they called it, empire at that time, and the Soviet empire. They were afraid that if Vietnam turned into a socialist government, that all of the countries of Southeast Asia would become socialist also. That was the reference in the poem about dominoes falling. There was a so-called domino theory during the Eisenhower administration that if Vietnam fell, all the rest of Southeast Asia would fall to communism just like a row of dominoes.
And the irony of that is that Dwight Eisenhower resisted great pressure to help the French during the First Indochina War. And the irony was that Jack Kennedy, although he didn't live long enough to carry it out, began to bring Americans into Southeast Asia. In fairness to the United States, and obviously I think it was a terrible mistake, but it's easy in hindsight to look back and say, oh my God, look at all the mistakes we made. In many respects, the Kennedy administration, both in Latin America and in Southeast Asia, saw itself, much like the Bush administration saw itself in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that is, once there was a conflict started, and these people asked us to come, at least some of the people did, and try to mitigate this conflict, that it was up to us to nation build, so to speak. One of the reasons that we've been in Iraq and Afghanistan so long is we felt as though it was our responsibility to get them back on their feet. And so that's a good impulse, but it's a misguided impulse at the same time. So that's, I mean, and also keep in mind this, the leaders of this country had been taught a lesson by World War II. And that is, if you don't stop aggressors, then you have to fight World War II. So that's, there is the, I mean, they weren't stupid people making these decisions. Let's make it
Yes,
clear.
but in Afghanistan, Russia could win a war the same as the French could, and then we went in after them. I have a question for you, Dr. Gill. Why, I know it was not a popular war in this country, but why were the returning soldiers so vilified by people? I mean, you didn't go because you wanted to go there and get killed. You went maybe because you were ordered to go.
Yeah, well, personally, I went because I was drafted and they sent
Right,
me.
right.
Plan A was go to Vietnam, Plan B was go to prison.
Yeah.
And you know. But why are they vilified? Well, you know, back in the middle 70s, after I had gotten back, I was a bit of an activist and a lobbyist for Veterans Affairs, so I testified before the House Veterans Affairs Committee. I was trying to get better educational benefits. And I was told there by a congressman that we shouldn't get one nickel in improved benefits because, one, there was never a real declared war. Two, if there was a war, we lost it.
That was the only war we ever lost.
Yeah.
Well,
These-
Well,
At that time.
yeah,
officially.
At that time, yes.
officially.
Oh,
Yes, ma'am.
You changed your mind. Sorry.
Go ahead.
You were talking about the Battle of Tonkin, is that the name of the city?
Pontoon.
It seemed very weird to me that our casualties were so low. You said we had 12 casualties for the U.S.?
12 dead and a couple hundred wounded.
Do you think that this was because of the lack of military training of the Vietcong, or just general because of the chaos of it?
No, we had a technological advantage in terms of artillery and the kinds of shells that were used, and also aircraft that was used in many cases. They use a newer version, for example, of attack helicopters now, but in those days we had what they call a Cobra Gunship that would fire 6,000 bullets a minute. And then it had a twin 40 millimeter cannon on the front that would shoot 400 explosive grenades a minute. And then on the other side, they had some rockets, some very large rockets. I forget the millimeter, but they were really scary things.
So it was because of our technological superiority.
Indeed, yeah.
And the other reason for high casualties for the enemy was because they were willing to die for a cause. That most of our guys were there because they didn't want to be there. So that was a big difference.
Yeah, I tended to hunker down.
Yes, Dr. Blanchard.
When William Carroll King came to the United States and was first interviewed, I remember distinctly, because I was in college and heard him interviewed, that he accused Americans and said we would lose the war because we were so naive. Yet, from that point on, it's been more a question of hubris that has been the reason, supposedly, we keep getting into these invasions and occupations of other countries. Which do you think played a larger role? Was it our ignorance of other people, geography, customs, policies, or was it just good old Greek hubris?
All of the above. Yeah, I mean, both, because, I said before, I think the American public accepts us being involved in these kinds of things, I think, mostly, for the best intentions. I mean, Libya is a great example, but we stopped short of this full-fledged invasion. But, you know, where the young ambassador got killed, that part of Libya, Gaddafi was sending troops with rising gas to exterminate a city of 300,000. Exterminate it. And we stopped it. So, you know, but that was a limited involvement. I mean, you know, there were people who opposed World War II, so it's a hard decision, you know, especially when you get involved with other people's lives.
Dr. Tate?
Given the situation we're in globally in terms of our political and technological state of war possibilities, is it even possible to win a war? We talk about, you know, why would we go to war when we can't win? We don't have an exit strategy, but it seems to me that since Vietnam, War is how we manage politics, and there is no winnable war in Vietnam. It's a military action to manage political conflicts that we literally manage. We don't win wars. Is it even possible?
You know, we have this historic vision and historic behavior and pattern that we can make it better somewhere else, whatever it is. In Southeast Asia, we decided we could make their political system similar to ours, create a government in our image, create an army to support that government. We sent people to train their army for about, we'll just say 15 years, nearly 15 years. And we've been doing the same thing in Afghanistan. And it's not making it better. It's you know, it's not hubris. We think we can do it right this one last time. My opinion about what's happening now, say in Afghanistan, is we take a man off the street, conscript him, draft him, and put him in the army. He gets basic training, infantry training, and in about 6 months, he's ready to go to war. We've been training the Afghan army for 12 years now. You would think they know what end of the weapon a bullet comes out of by now.
Oh, God. They don't. Can I address that real quick? I know it seems like we're painting this gloomy picture, but there are incidents where American foreign policy does do some good. The Operation Allied Force in Southeastern Europe is an example. And I'm reminded, Wesley Clark was commander, overall commander of U.S. forces, Allied forces at the time. And the United States, as one writer wrote, was playing patty cake with Slobodan Milosevic. I mean, everything we were doing was very limited. We were trying to do this within the confines of NATO policy. In particular, the Italians were very squeamish about getting involved in some big war. And Wesley Clark came to an NSA meeting with President Clinton, and he said to him, "Mr. President, forgive me, folks, are we gonna, or get off the pot?" And he said, "What we ought to be doing is write the final chapter now and figure out how to get to that." And they did. And as Clark wrote later, we turned out the lights in Belgrade 2 days later, and the war ended. Okay, so we can do those things, but also consider this. How long did that conflict last? It's not up to Americans to go to another country, as tempting as it may be, and tell them how, after they've been a country like Persia, Iran, or Iraq for thousands of years and have older cultures than we do, how to behave, how to have a government, and how to run it. So nation building is a problem. And if you think about it for a minute, everyone in this room is either a child or a parent, and the worst thing you can do with your children is to do their work for them. They don't learn anything. So you try to guide them, and then when it's time, you go do it yourself.
That's exactly what I'm thinking. That's exactly what I'm thinking.
Are you off by yourself?
I'm so serious.
A question here.
How do we choose which countries we help? Because there's a lot of them that we need help and that have a lot of stuff going on with them. How do we choose which ones that we go and help?
The lottery.
That's what you should be asking. Seriously. You're a voter, you're a citizen. I don't know what you're going to do with your life, but you're going to have to make sure the people who make those decisions make the right one.
Yeah, but we don't have much say in what
Oh,
they,
yes, we do.
we do?
Yes, ma'am. I've worked for a couple politicians. See those whiteboards? Max Cleland used to have a whiteboard, and he would read editorials every morning, 15, 20 newspapers across the state. He knew who stood where and for what, and it affected how he voted in Congress, in the Senate. So I know that's
Why doesn't
pretty
the
evident.
90% of people who want gun control affect the people in our government?
Well, you know, it could happen.
Part of the answer to your question, ma'am, is the State Department advises the Secretary of State on who we go to help, and they decide that partially on the regional effect of instability. For example, if there is instability in Saudi Arabia or anywhere in the Mediterranean basin, it's going to mess with our oil. So, you see where I'm going? The answer is we help those places in the world that are connected to our economy. If their wheels fall off in any country that contributes something significant to America's economy, then we go help them.
How come we don't care so much about people that aren't having anything with our economy? It's going to help you.
There's no money in it. There's nothing in it for us. It's you know, foreign relations requires you to think in different ways than humaneness. You have to always start at, well, you don't always have to, but this has been the pattern. The pattern is to start out asking the question, what's in it for us?
Is there no oil in Syria?
No,
I mean, that way they're not going to have.
they're ports.
Hmm?
They're ports, but they're not,
So, in response to what you said a while ago, it seems that ever since World War II, the United States has been the big brother to the entirety of the world. Like it's our responsibility to make sure that these things get taken care of. Do you think there's ever going to come a time when the United States finally goes, that's enough, take care of your own business?
Well, first of all, since World War II, at first the Soviet Union and the United States. Will there come a time? It may not be in my lifetime, but I suspect so. I mean, the British used to have what they call Pax Britannia, which was peace of Britain. The Romans used to have Pax Romana, which they basically told everybody what to do. We're the world's policemen now. And frankly, forgive me for being a patriot, but I can't think of any country I'd rather. There's a lot of worse ones out there that could do a lot worse job, but I can't, the answer is I don't know. I just don't know.
Well, believe me, I come up around the South America. This is the best country to live in.
Other questions? Randy?
First of all, the person who asks those loving questions, you can be that way till you die. You don't ever have to become jaded and forget what matters in life. But what would you say is the part that profit is now playing in our war approach? Because it wasn't that way in Vietnam. We didn't have companies that were saying, let's go there and fight because I can sell weapons, I can make money. So what are we losing in power to companies that want war for profit?
Now,
Didn't Eisenhower warn us against that?
You know what? There were, in fact, many major American corporations that made money off of support for the war in Vietnam, as I'm sure there are some who are doing so at the present time. And you'd be surprised at the names of these companies. Frigidaire Refrigerator Company made 50 caliber ammunition for machine guns. General Motors made M16 rifles that did not work really very well. They manufactured $400 one-shot rifles. It's really distressing.
They got better later.
to have one of those. Dow Chemical Company made Agent Orange and defoliated the Central Highlands. You know, it was, they had an operation there of chemical spray, they called it Operation Ranch Hand. By modern day standards, that company and the American government was involved in a major crime against humanity, using weapons of mass destruction. We stopped Gaddafi from using poison gas, but we used not exactly poison gas, but a chemical defoliant that was a known carcinogen.
And caused many birth defects that are still showing up in the population today.
I
Yeah.
think that one of the things, if you don't mind, that is pretty much ignored in discussing the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, is the civilian suffering which you began to touch on in these places. And, you know, when you read about it, it's almost unbelievable, the millions of Vietnamese, Iraqis, and Afghans that have died or have become disabled from these conflicts. And that might be a lesson too, that if we're going to get in, a lot of people are going to suffer. A lot of people who are innocent. So, you know, a lot of these places, they don't want us to.
Changing the subject, what's going to happen with North Korea? They don't know.
North Korea.
Nothing happened yet.
Should we pray?
That's a need to know comment.
Same thing.
Somebody has to manufacture a way to
We
let
need to
this
be
guy
afraid of
back out.
Iran too.
Is there a final question maybe out there? Does anybody want to get in something?
I would like to know how many women's on that wall.
Women?
How many women are on the wall? I don't know
If
the
they
answer.
died, if a person died in Vietnam, they're on that wall.
There are 53.
53? Yeah. Thought it was-
I go to the wall every Memorial Day. Have you heard of the Rolling Thunder Ride?
I saw the replica of the wall.
Okay. Last year, well, the Rolling Thunder Ride began with Vietnam veterans who owned a motorcycle and could still ride one, went to the wall to do homage to their friends. So it grew from, I guess about 18 years ago, a group of about 1,500 guys. Last year, we had 940,000 bikers in town.
Wow.
I'm going to keep riding until we hit 1 million. You know, most of the time when I give a talk, people ask about what can I read that will help me understand this topic. I jotted down a couple of titles if anyone is interested. If you're interested in the journalists who did the job in Vietnam, there's a wonderful book called Requiem. All the work of all the photojournalists who died on the job in Vietnam are in that book, both male and female. Bernard Fall's there too. If you're interested in major problems and issues that we did not get to talk about, there's a book by James McMahon called Major Problems and Issues in the Vietnam War. That's the 4th edition. If you're interested, I work at a women's college. If you don't know what Spelman College is, it's a women's college. And the ladies want to know, okay, well, so what about the women? There's a wonderful book called Catherine Marshall called In the Combat Zone. And it tells the story of all the different kinds of women who worked there. Most people think that there were just Army nurses there and that's it, but that's not true. So there are about 30 different biographies of women who worked, who went to Vietnam. If you're interested in just small vignettes about what's it like to do job A or B, everybody in Vietnam didn't drive a tank or shoot a rifle. There's a book called 365 Days. Very short chapters, written by a man who was a physician there in Vietnam and took care of the people when they came in from the field, and he wrote a little story about all the different kinds of jobs. Okay?
And you can always buy our books, so.
I want to thank Drs. Isaacs, Gillian, and Head for being here and for the excellent presentations. And thanks to you all for showing up. That's it.